join the Catalyst Club. So I thought what I'd do is just show you real quick how to do something like that. If you haven't yet, or even if you have gone to the Academy, so it's academy.careinnovations.org, you'll come to the login page. And you can see there's a register here. You're already registered, you don't have to. So Kathleen sent the email and the notes about what your initial password is. You can update that, of course. But I got to go over here to my other computer and log in. So when you log into the Academy, you're going to go to your dashboard. And I should put myself on a smaller size here. And so when you log in, you'll go to your dashboard. And you can see there's courses and the forums. But right over here is the program clubs. And that's where you want to go to join or participate in the Catalyst clubs. It's also up here on the, it's also up here on the navigation. So let's click on it. Chris, don't take so much time to explain these things. And you'll come to the page with all the clubs. You may not be part of most of them, which is probably true. And the ones you're not a part of, it'll have Join Club at the bottom. So I am part of the Catalyst, but you might see Join Club here. And you just click on that, and it'll allow you to join. And then you'll come to the clubs dashboard, the announcement page basically. And that's how you get in there. Now, what Kathleen would like you to do is make a nice introduction. So click on the Catalyst introductions. I'm going to see if I can't turn this screen down a little bit. The brightness is a little high, I think. There we go. Click on the Catalyst introductions, and you can introduce yourself. So we have Allie, and Allie has set the bar for cool photographs of the world we inhabit outside of CCI and Catalyst. This is her doing a fire performance at Burning Man. I love it. Rigo's got a wonderful wedding picture here, beautiful, and people are introducing themselves, so please join in and do so. Wesley is showing us his mean dance moves. It's so awesome. And of course, Andrea is showing us how high she can jump. Hopefully she didn't go off the back there. So please join the Catalyst Club. It's a great resource for you. There's the calendar, the program roster, the resource library. That's where we post everything that we're doing, things you can grab afterwards. And of course, every live stream we have is in the calendar. So that's first things first. But let's talk about systems design now. I hope everybody's doing well. And why don't, while I'm here, Allie's letting us know that the calendar times will be adjusted. Tuesday, Thursday sessions will start at noon like usual. So just a quick note, today is an anomaly. And we will be doing noon going forward. Unless we get an amazing, like, 5,000 people writing in and saying, you know, 1 o'clock works much better for us. Maybe we can change it, but we might not have to do that. Okay, let's talk a little bit about systems design. So systems design is more than a 5-decade-old practice. It kind of emerged with city planning, the emergence of computers, when people started realizing they could look at the world in more complex ways than we could traditionally do so. And systems thinking was developed in a number of fields, and it's applied across all fields at this point. And in fact, CCI has some nice resources for you on systems thinking. They've applied it in their one of their programs, I think, Resilient Beginnings, or maybe the medically assisted treatment. I'm not sure which one, but there's some good resources that hopefully we can link to as well in the club for additional resources for you guys. But let's start out by thinking about systems from kind of a field you may not be that familiar with, but maybe some of you are gardeners. But look at this garden. This is a very traditional way we put our gardens together. in the Western world. Those are tomato plants in neat rows, very far apart. Back here, back at the top, you can see corn in this garden, all in nice, rows, a monoculture. And in the back of the picture, you see the industrial scale monoculture of corn. And what we now know today is this way of planting and tending a garden, especially both on an individual scale but also on an industrial scale, is not sustainable. It's not very healthy, and it leads to all sorts of problems. And people who studied this noticed things that this garden is not using the natural forces of the system of which it is part, which is nature. And so because it's working against many of the forces, lots of problems happen. And I want you to think about, as I show these examples, obviously we're applying it to our own projects. So in what ways are the assumptions about how we do things, how things are organized, are they working against how we might be able to set them up so they work better? And in, the Earth was the original permaculture, permaculture is a systems approach to developing land and food and a resilient presence on the Earth by treating yourself as part of an ecosystem. And certainly any land or area that you have access to, that you also treat it in alignment with nature. But it goes beyond that. It brings in design principles. And so there's other things we know and there's other things we can do that nature can't do. So we can create features in our landscape that help it work better. So permaculture is a systems approach to gardening and or larger scale farming. That is things like food forests and a systems approach, again, to food. And when you have a permaculture, you have an ecosystem that's working together that's far more efficient, far more abundant, and has less problems, and it's less impactful. So it's less resource intense, or at least inputs that you bring in from the outside is much less. So in a permaculture, you have levels of plants, and you know that things are growing at different times, and you companion plant, and you control the flow of water across your property. So lots of times in lots of cities, you have lots of flooding because it rains and it all gets washed away down the drain. So in permaculture, you don't let the water run off your property. As it comes through your property, you create swales to drive the water into the ground, and you store it in the ground for future use when it gets dry. So there's lots of principles in here. And there's an understanding of the different scales or levels of growth, from the overstory tree layer, the very big trees, all the way down to the roots, but then you also have things like vines that use the trees. And these are all symbiotic systems. So think about, this is a more in-depth look at what's going on in a small ecological system. And in fact, the people that create small permaculture gardens have microclimates right in their yard. They have microclimates that help control the temperature, the humidity of that microclimate. And they have lots more growth of life, and hence a yield of fruits, vegetables, etc., and other resources like wood across the year. Okay, along with looking at it as a system, there are principles that help you drive additional benefits from that system. So I want you to think about not only, if we look back at these slides, it's the nature of the system, like what is there and how do they work and what's their character, how big are they, etc. But you also have principles that are at work. And so these permaculture principles guide your actions and your goals in that system. So think about, in your project, you could start writing down, what are some of our principles? So here it's catch and store energy, observe and interact, pay attention to what's going on in the yard so you can adjust, use value and diversity. diversity is a huge principle of permaculture, and it's kind of ironic. It's obvious in nature that diversity is beneficial, and yet somehow in our human systems we tend to drive out diversity. Integrate. Use small, slow solutions, right? Start small, learn fast. These are principles that are very much in alignment with Catalyst. Okay. So if we look not just at a permaculture garden, but if we look at a farm, you can see here is a diagram like you can create for your own project of what are the different elements. Here on a farm, you have the farmer, the chickens, the woodlands, the pasture. These are all different elements that have different characteristics, and they all interact and have relationships in different ways. This is the principle of systems and systems design, both analysis and synthesis. And here's somebody looking at la casa que no degrada su entorno. So a house that doesn't degrade the environment. If you look at your place where you live as a system interacting with the environment, there's lots of things you can do to create a more beneficial relationship between your house and the environment, and making sure that you're more resilient and sustainable in your own living, right? So how do these principles apply to your project, and how can you start using them as a catalyst? So the one thing I want to note is the reason why systems design isn't so, or systems thinking isn't so natural to you, is because you were brought up in a world of education, primarily textbook education that was very linear, very well structured, very topic, split apart into topics, and those topics were split apart into problems. And the problems you solved growing up were all well-structured problems. There's a point to the problem, there's a known way to get to the solution, and the solution is known, okay? That's textbook problem solving. That's what you mostly do, and that's why so many businesses or organizations approach the world in this very I know the answer. It's because you're using a very textbook mindset when you're approaching your problem solving. But the problems you're working on are complex systems. They are communities with many actors, not at all coordinated, with different goals. So imagine as you start, so if you're trying to recruit families into your services, think about how many other organizations may be trying to do the exact same thing, recruit families. And so if you start looking at it as a system, you realize you're not the only one trying to do what you do. And you also start realizing that there's other resources in this community system that you might be able to develop relationships with, use the forces of, and play a particular role to create a more sustainable, efficient, and growth-oriented system. Okay? So a systems thinker thinks in wholes, not necessarily just in parts. We don't believe problems or systems are linear. We think they're nonlinear. In fact, systems are nonlinear. You do both analysis and synthesis. You think about processes, networks, and relationships much more so than individual things that are static. So you think more in holistic and dynamic sense. So I just want you to take a simple approach to systems thinking and think about a few of these topics in relationship to your project and maybe create a systems map of your project. So elements and relationships are extremely important. It's like what exists and are there any relationships between them? Where there's a lack of relationships, when you get into solution-oriented thinking later on, you might say maybe there should be a relationship between these entities that there isn't any, right? Feedback is a huge aspect of systems. So the outputs of one system can be inputs to another, and you can also measure something that's happening, and based on what's happening, do a balancing force or a balancing action. So feedback, so a thermostat is one of the simplest systems people use to describe systems. So you have a temperature in a room, you have a sensor, and when the temperature drops to a certain level, it heats it up, and then it gets past that level and it turns off, and then it slowly goes down. And so you have this dynamic system. And you can get bad feedback loops. There's all sorts of theory involved in this, but like I said, I'm not going to be doing that. So the interdependence of elements, inputs and outputs, dynamics over time, and patterns that you see. This is another thing I think you guys would take to naturally, which is thinking about the patterns you see. And these are the ideas that we always tell ourselves, like, well, here's what we always do when this situation comes up. That's a pattern. And you can disrupt those patterns. First, you got to recognize them, and you can disrupt them or adjust them to create beneficial patterns in your system. Okay, so just these 6 elements, in fact, the first one and some relationships, is all you need to do to start. So just think about these 6 elements in relationship to a permaculture garden. What are the elements in the relationships? Well, it's the different kinds of plants. And some plants are planted next to another one to provide nitrogen, because it's a nitrogen fixer, and the other one is a nitrogen taker. And so understanding the possible relationships of where things should go, inputs and outputs. How do we minimize the inputs to our garden and increase the output of food and oxygen and joy that comes from this, right? What's the interdependence? What feedback do we get by observing our garden? We see if we're in it on a weekly basis, we start to see what's happening, we can adjust and give some balancing input, right? So I took a look at just this notion of what if we had a recruitment system for families, for family services. So actually if we look, I didn't want to do that, I want to do this. So we have families in a community that we want to recruit. So we figure out and we take some recruitment actions. And therefore, we get some contacts of people coming in. And some of them enroll in our services, and some of them don't enroll. But now they're aware of our services. And now we can start thinking about, well, are there alternative recruitment actions we can take for people who know about us but haven't yet committed? For those who enroll, can we demonstrate that they have an improved quality of life or quality of family life? And how does that improve overall the families in the community? So I literally brainstormed this in about 10 minutes this morning when I thought, like, I have to start thinking about maybe family recruitment in a more systemic way. Now this can feel almost like a process diagram, but just laying down the elements and potential relationships between them or flows, it also allows me to now think on a layer on top of this, right? So who might our partners be in attracting families? What places should we look to attract families? Should we go to churches or places of work? Or it helps us think through more things. Our recruitment actions, can we use unique channels? Can we use families that, can we use families that have enrolled to start recruiting other families that haven't enrolled? So maybe now we use our families to recruit, right? Can we provide rewards or perks for people who do enroll that are beneficial to the community, that maybe highlight local businesses or other services, right? So the only reason I do this is to show the power of systems thinking in thinking about your project and exploring it, okay? So that's a quick overview of systems thinking. Let me give you a quick example. So in New Hampshire, there was a fire department that, in fact, a firefighter who had a personal experience with somebody who was either overdosed or was looking for help to detox from their substance, from opioids. And he actually had an idea and went to the mayor and suggested that they start this thing called safe stations. And basically the idea of a safe station is that the fireplaces became intake points or a safe haven for people to come when they felt like they were having a problem controlling their addiction and they wanted to get help. And so I'm going to play a quick 1.5-minute video here of this example. Let me make sure I have sound and volume. Okay.
Since 2016, Manchester's Safe Station program has helped more than 4,000 people struggling with addiction. what we wanted to do was capture that moment that someone needs the most.
The program turns fire stations into an access point to help people get into treatment fast, a place they can access 24/7. Researchers at Dartmouth College conducted a 7-month study, and after completing dozens of interviews, their report finds the program to be effective and welcome in the community.
They, sat with us, and I gave them kind of full access to this process and this program, and it really told us what I expected it to say, that we're doing some good things.
The report says the program is a helpful resource and that firefighters are well positioned to be a contact point for help because people are raised to trust them.
People feel comfortable about going into our fire stations because the firefighters treat people with respect and care.
To this day, the Safe Station program continues to evolve and many improvements have been made.
Prior to January, it took, around 6 weeks for people to get into treatment. Now on average it's taking 2 days. So we really have a nice commitment from the partnerships that we're working with to ensure that people are getting the services that they need.
Now, the report also pointed out some areas for improvement, such as training and education. It's something the fire chief tells us tonight he welcomes. Live in Manchester, Kristen Carosa, WMUR News 9.
Okay, so this is a small example of recognizing that other systems, the fire prevention system, might play a role in the recovery and treatment system. And you heard a little bit in there about why they think people would go to the fire stations rather than to a hospital or to a clinic or to the police station, et cetera, or an emergency room. And I think it really says something about understanding the nature of things, the nature of the elements in your community. The fire station doesn't have a point of view one way or another about treatment. It's about saving people. And so in that sense, it has this interesting trust and different nature that allows people for some reason to go there without, when they wouldn't normally go to necessarily a drug addiction center or a hospital. So an interesting case study where a personal experience led a firefighter to ask the mayor to try safe stations, connecting two systems that were unconnected before. They do a medical assessment, a minor medical assessment to make sure they don't need immediate care. And of course they have a caring ear. They listen to them as they come in. And they have the time to do that at the fire station because they're not serving hundreds of people. Now, of course, if a fire call came in, that would interrupt that meeting somehow, right? But it's interesting, firefighters, the nature of that is also that they're on call and not necessarily busy 24/7. So that's an interesting component that allows these systems to fit together. Okay, and then they will transport people to the service, which gives one of the social determinants of health, transportation, and knowing which service to go to improves. And then they also, if they come in like late at night, they give them a safe place to stay because you can sleep at the station until morning when they transport them. So a short example of systems thinking and really a system solution in New Hampshire and their safe stations. So think about the elements and relationships, the feedback that can happen in your system, interdependence, inputs and outputs, dynamics over time, and patterns. So with that, I'll stop and see if there's any questions. It's a very short overview of systems design, but hopefully it gives you a sense with this notion of the permaculture example that when you start really thinking about systems, vast transformations can happen. And permaculture is being used in lots of climates where the tradition has been to just work the land until it's dried out and used up. When you implement permaculture principles, the land and the bounty and the yield gets better and better year over year. So think about that, how your solution can get better over time by the elements you pull together. Okay, any comments out in the world there? Let's see. Veronica says, what a nice topic, yay. Thanks, Veronica. Yeah, and as I said, if you do a little searching on systems design, you're going to encounter a lot of different angles and resources. My graduate degree studies were in systems design, innovation, and I taught a 16-week class on structured planning, which you're going to hear about in just a second. So if there's no questions, I'm going to move on to the second topic. And I inserted this one. Yeah, nice. Great comparison between the two systems. Yeah, this is what's so important about identifying the nature of elements in your system, the nature, and writing that down and being open to it and saying what role might that other system play, even though they're not they're not doing what we're doing, but how can we be complementary? That is a great point. Okay, so I understand some of you may need to drop off at 3:30 or at 1:30, sorry, your time. But I want to do a short topic on design factors. And I decided to put this in here, it's more of an experiment, so you got to tell me whether this information is useful to you or not. But I came up with the idea because last week when I was coaching CCI's team, when I listened to them talk, I could tell that they were thinking through elements of their project and making observations about those elements. So in this case, it was about deliverable feedback, right? I think I said that on one of the lives we had last week. And they noticed something about deliverable feedback. They made an observation about why it might be challenging in that part to play a role in building the culture or something. I'm totally butchering the description of this, but it was about feedback. It was an observation. And what I noticed is that's design information we used to capture, and I encouraged them to get more of that down on their boards last week. So I want to offer you this idea of capturing your design information in a certain format that is kind of creative now, that helps you get into your project, but then is useful as you go down the road. And it's not just necessarily organized sticky notes on a board. So design information is information you document to help the team understand the nature and scope of the problem and where pain points might be. And this is just a little bit more of a note-taking process rather than a journey map, which we'll do later, or other diagrams we might use to explain the system. This is really very helpful at the beginning when you're noticing things about your problem. And it contains observations of something that isn't quite right, that you notice and you're like, I'm not sure if that's working properly, or people really have a trouble with this in our topic. But it also includes your early thinking on strategies or ideas for maybe addressing that later. And all you do is document this on a simple form. So let me give you an example of how this works. So you do this all the time in your everyday life with things that you encounter, and you're like, I can't believe they do it this way. Or I can't believe these things are like this. When you do that, you're noting, if you were a designer, you'd be like, I'm going to fix it. I'm going to figure out a new thing to improve it. But since you're not a designer, you just get frustrated, but you note it. And so what I'm saying is you have the skills to do these things. You already do it. So watering the garden. Quick observation. When watering the garden, and I'm just playing on our permaculture theory here, or theme. When watering the garden, the connections between hoses and sprayers always leak, don't they? Or they're always like, all of a sudden you got something spraying at you from between the hose and the sprinkler or whatever. And so that's a pain point or an observation about what happens that isn't quite right in doing an activity, in this case, watering the garden. And what are some strategies? Now, strategies are general directions that don't imply a specific solution. And this is easier to come up with. Like, why can't we eliminate the connections in our hoses and sprinklers? Why can't we create more reliable connections? And so those are strategies. But then that could also lead to very specific ideas. Well, how could I eliminate connections? Well, maybe I could create an integrated watering hose and sprayer, where you don't buy a hose separate from the sprayer, you buy it together and just lay it out and water your grass without having to connect anything. Self-repairing connections. How can we make these connections self-repairing? Or how do we maybe cover up every connection with a rubber band or something that keeps it from leaking, right? So those are very specific ideas. So all you want to do is capture those insights for your project. So it's important to capture them along the way. They're observations that have an element of challenge or paradox in them. And this simple structure, what I'm introducing today as a design factor, can be used to capture these. And I think this, if you can think about this as documenting these in these notes rather than debating them with your team. And because that's what was happening in the CCI team, they were debating whether that thing mattered or not at this point in their project. And I told them, just get more of those things down, but I didn't have a way except put more sticky notes on your board to give them insight into how to do that. And then what this adds is that you're adding these strategies or ideas. So just so you know, there's a lot of research and important work behind this. This comes from a much larger structured planning process that my advisor in college developed and was world renowned for. And it comes from their activity analysis and design factor. Now I greatly simplified it for us, where there's just an activity that you're talking about. In my case, it was watering, in that case I just gave you. The observation you make, the strategies you might have, or the solution ideas. And I put together a quick little PDF that you guys can print out. And I made it so that there's 2 per page. So when you print them out, you can write them down 2 to a page, cut them in half, and have a little stack of these design factors. Of course, you can also build this, and we'll probably build one in Miro and provide a template for it. But these should be used very quickly and almost on when you notice something. So if you're doing research this week or next, think about using these design factors when you come out of that research. And you can say, hey, I was talking to somebody, and they were talking about this activity they do, and I noticed that they talked about these things as problems. Well, I thought, well, maybe we could make some strategies for addressing those, and I may or may not have some specific solution ideas. These are not solution ideas that you're committing to. They're simply building out this, what's called the solution space once you get to problem-solving mode, or once you get to ideation. And you can go back through these things and familiarize yourself with all the pain points and observations you've had to date as you start thinking about framing your problem and going to ideation. Okay, so that's design factors. So I'll stop there and ask for any questions overall. That's all the lessons, both system design and design factors today. Hopefully that was helpful to you to think about your project and to look at the core elements of your system. What kind of questions do you guys have? I'm going to give myself a little bit more oomph in the frame. And I just want to say also that last week on the work session on Friday, it seemed like you guys were really cranking. The few teams and few boards that I looked into, and then reports from Vinu, Kathleen, and other coaches just indicated that you guys were really making progress. Hopefully you appreciated that time together. Okay. Any other questions? We got some. We still have plenty of folks on. I'm going to pause here a little bit. What else can I talk about while you might ask 1 or 2 questions? You should be interviewing this week. You should do at least a pilot interview as your Monday morning email outlined. And remember that an interview is nothing that has to be super formal. You can write down a few foreshadowed questions before you go, like I'd like to talk to so-and-so about how they do this thing, or what they experienced with that initiative last year. You know, you can, and then to do the interview, you just start with open-ended questions, which is, first of all, thanks for joining me, and I really appreciate your time. I really want to know what really happens, not what's supposed to happen. I'm not interested in things that the system thinks should be happening, but I'm interested in your actual experience and what really happened, the things that didn't go well, ways you adapted because how the system is set up doesn't work. And so set that stage, and then, okay, so tell me a little bit about how you became involved in that initiative, and then we'll talk about the initiative overall. And so you kind of start with an open-ended question about maybe them or their background with the issue at hand. And then you could go into, okay, take me through how that initiative happened, what you did, and what you experienced along the way. And then remember to pause and let them start talking. So this week, really try to do a pilot interview with someone in your project space, in your topic space, especially if it's an end user, somebody in the community. And then the other thing to do is to really look at the power structures. I forgot to mention that a little bit in the systems, but all these dimensions that we've been talking about for your project exploration can be looked at in the system. And I think looking at the equity in the system, and of course the power structures, where decisions get made, who gets to make them, what kinds of decisions are made by who holds power, how do they wield it, things like that. Do that, put that layer on top of your system diagram. That can be super informative. Like there's really there's 2 core power structures in our topic area that we really have to address in terms of either working closely with them, bringing them on board early so that they understand where we're going, using their resources and power for the benefit of the community. So definitely take a look at that. Okay, I am not seeing many questions come in. I am not seeing any questions come in, so I'm not going to belabor the point. I'm going to wish you guys a wonderful afternoon and a good week. Please don't hesitate to reach out with an email or go over and post in the Catalyst forums or in the Catalyst Club any specific questions you have about your work or resources you need. So with that, I'd like to thank you guys for joining us, and I will sign off. Final apology for the time mix-up. We're going back to noon starting Thursday, I believe. We'll confirm that, and I'll send an email out so you guys know. And it should show up on your calendars properly. So with that, thank you so much for joining us today, and I look forward to working with you. Ciao.